Hey folks, today I'll be reviewing another game submitted via our Patreon page, and today's game comes from Abu, who played this classical game, runs into the Pirc defense, and has a little bit of a tough time in the opening, so we'll definitely talk about how I would approach this one from an e4 player's point of view. And then the game gets into a really interesting middle game battle as it relates to the structure in the center, and both players make some really interesting decisions. So with that, let's get into it. So e4, d6, white plays knight f3 here, black plays knight f6, knight c3, g6, and eventually white plays d4. I would recommend going ahead and just playing d4 right away whenever the opponent doesn't directly challenge the center, and then bringing out this knight first, and then kind of deciding what you want to do with this other knight. For instance, against this setup with knight f6, knight c3, and g6, personally I'm a fan of the Pirc 150 attack with bishop e3 and queen to d2, followed by castling queenside, also known as, let's say, like an English attack. And in these kinds of positions, sometimes the knight comes out to f3, sometimes this square is very useful for the pawn, so you can defend the e4 pawn, cover the g4 square, and I think it makes sense for white to be a little bit more flexible when going for this kind of setup. That said, there are many decent setups with the move knight f3 included, as well as like bishop e3, queen d2 here, so this is all totally playable. Just my personal preference is to keep the knight on g1 flexible. So knight f3, g6, d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, castles, and here after a bit of a think, white plays h3. And yeah, there is a real choice here according to White's notes. They also consider moves like bishop to c4 and queen to d2. Now bishop c4, we always have to watch out for this kind of trick, and I think it does work in this position with knight takes e4, where black snags a pawn, and then after knight takes e4, plays d5, wins back the piece, and generally black does quite okay in these positions as they've managed to trade some stuff off. Queen d2 I definitely like, and Abu mentioned in their notes that what they didn't like is the possibility of a knight to g4, hence the move h3. But the issue with the move h3 here is if we do want to play for this kind of attack with queen d2, castling queenside, bishop h6, etc., then we're really going to want to run the pawn up with h4, h5. So that's why I think h3 is not quite congruent with White's plan. And after queen d2, we're not really afraid of knight g4, as usually we should be able to play something like bishop to g5, and in general this isn't really very dangerous for White. One day we'll get a tempo on the knight with h3, but eventually this pawn will run up to h4 and try to damage black's kingside. And if black plays something like h6, let's say bishop h4, g5, bishop to g3, we're always ready to crack black's kingside open with a move like h4, and I think White is doing really well in this kind of position. And then from here again, White is typically castling queenside and playing for the kingside attack. So yeah, my recommendation here would just be queen to d2, queenside castles, bishop h6, h4, h5, and I think White gets some really nice attacking chances. The light square bishop can come out to d3 in many cases to support the e4 pawn, but of course it's a dynamic game. It's really going to depend on what black does. So in the game we see h3, and now black throws out e5, which is definitely a really interesting move, and giving White a big choice, whether to push d5, take on e5, or just keep the tension with a move like queen to d2. Now White decides to push d5 and take the space. I think this was probably the second best choice. D takes e5 seems to be the way to play it, but the point here is that when we get this kind of exchange type of structure, White's pieces are a little bit more developed towards the center. The bishop on g7 isn't so great. This move h3 is actually pretty useful covering the g4 square. So for example, after queen takes d8, rook takes d8, I think White definitely gets at least a small advantage in this endgame. Something like bishop c4 makes sense. White can also play bishop d3 followed by castling queenside, and then eventually setting up ideas like knight g5, bishop c4. And I think, yeah, White is at least slightly better in this position. Instead we see d5, and the problem with this one is that White takes some space, but black can immediately challenge the space with the c6 move, and White is simply not able to hold on to the pawn on d5. Now if White takes in this position, probably black will play b takes c6, taking with the pawn and keeping the d5 square under control. Instead we see queen to d2. And now black plays rook to e8, kind of a slow move. I think the idea might be to avoid bishop h6, so that black can play bishop to h8. Not that this is really something that black always wants to do in these kinds of positions. I think in general, if the center is going to be closed, black should be kind of okay with trading off the dark square bishops here. So rook e8 is a bit slow. I think black definitely should have taken on d5. And the reason that black should do it right away is because white would be forced to take back with a pawn. Because knight takes d5 drops the e4 pawn after knight takes e4. This is no good for white. White is forced to take back with the pawn, and this is a very nice structure. Black has a fantastic pawn on e5. Black can always push this one if they want to, but can just hold on to it. And in the meantime, white has basically no pressure on the d file in the center. So yeah, I think black missed their chance here. Definitely they should take, and then black is at least fine here with knight d7, queen c7. The knight can come out to c5. I think black is doing really well. So rook to e8, white goes bishop to c4. The move makes sense, kind of reinforcing white's control over the d5 square, but again gives black another opportunity to strike against white's center. White definitely needed to take on c6 at this point. And now, compared to the previous position, white is a little bit ahead here, right? White got queen d2 and rook e8, and so if black takes with the pawn here, then white is just castling queenside, and black is not going to get enough for the pressure against the d pawn. In fact, black is just losing the pawn. Can try to sack it with something like d5, but it's a little bit dangerous for white, but I don't think it's going to be enough here. I think white is just going to be a pawn up very soon. So this is kind of the problem with what black has done. This is why black needed to take on d5 earlier, because now white can just open up the d file and get a lot of pressure. And after something like knight takes c6, let's say white castles queenside, it's not even so much about taking the d6 pawn. It's more that white also has this d5 square under their control and can actually play against this one too. So for example, bishop e6 here. Let's say white goes king to b1 and then follows up with knight g5, bishop to c4. Black's light squares here are going to be in a lot of trouble. Of course, with knight to g5, we're threatening either to take the bishop or force the bishop to move away, and then bishop c4 is going to be quite a nice move for white. So this was a way for white to get, I think, a pretty nice strategic advantage. And even though the kings are castled on opposite sides of the board, I would say this is more of a strategic advantage because we have a ton of pressure against the d6 pawn, we have the d5 square, and it's almost like black played a dragon and then played this move e5, which generally considered to be a serious mistake in that kind of structure. So instead, bishop c4 is seen in the game, and now black does take on d5, but now white actually has enough pieces to recapture on d5 with a piece, and Abu correctly takes with the bishop here, because black can take the bishop, but white gets to keep a really strong knight on d5, and now I think white has a very clear advantage. What black should have done after bishop c4 was actually start hunting down the bishop with b5. And probably white was going to go bishop to b3 here, but now the point is that black has either b4, hitting the knight, which is unfortunately defending the e4 pawn, and that's going to ask a very uncomfortable question to white, or black can play c5, which is possibly even stronger, threatening to play c4, trapping the bishop, and if knight takes b5, then knight takes e4, black takes this massive central pawn, can follow up with f5, of course white has to move the queen, then f5 could happen, and yeah, basically black would just be doing great in this position, total control over the center, and white's pieces are pretty bad. So this was the way for black to take advantage, this b5 and c5 strike, which I think is pretty thematic and pretty instructive. Instead, we do see white getting a nice square on d5 in the game. And after knight c6, queenside castling, we have a position similar to the one we saw before, where white has just really nice pressure against the d6 pawn and a very nice knight on d5. Now black plays bishop e6, knight to g5, rook to c8, king to b1. I like this move, just keeping the tension, keeping the pressure here. White definitely could have taken on e6, but there's definitely no rush. And here black blunders with knight e7 and ends up losing the game, although white doesn't really proceed here in the most accurate way. So white takes on e7 first, then after rook takes e7, takes on d6. White could have taken the bishop here, but then rook takes e6 would defend the d6 pawn. So what white should have done is actually just take the bishop first, knight takes e6. And now after f takes e6, knight takes e7, white has traded off a bunch of pieces, is going to be winning the d6 pawn, it just gets a very, very healthy extra pawn. Let's say queen takes e7, queen takes d6, and this endgame I think would be pretty much decisive for white. Healthy extra pawn, better structure, better rooks, better bishop, so many positional advantages. So a little bit inaccurate here from white. After knight e7, we take on e7, rook takes e7, queen takes d6. The difference here is that we haven't thrown in knight takes e6 yet, and so black could have kept the bishop with, let's say, queen takes d6, I think was best, rook takes d6, and then either bishop c4 or bishop d7 here, for example. In the notes, Abu mentions they were going to take on a7 here. And yeah, actually, white does get 2 extra pawns, but bishop to c6, black has a little bit of pressure here. The threat is to play h6, and white is very far from winning this position, so definitely black could have, I think, resisted a bit better. Instead, in the game, we see rook to d7 here, and Abu nicely finds knight takes e6, which leads to some excellent simplifications for white as the queen on d8 is hit. If fe6, queen takes e6, check, just wins immediately. So rook takes d6, knight takes d8, we get a bunch of exchanges, and white gets to take on a7, winning a second pawn, and now white just has a completely winning endgame. So black tried to defend from here, but Abu's technique, I think, was perfectly sound, and yeah, black was never really able to get back into the game, losing the third pawn here, and yeah, it was basically pretty much over from here. So a bit of a collapse there from black, especially this move. Knight e7 ends up being kind of a tactical blunder, because white's position was better, but not quite winning yet. Then white could have done better here. It would have been much more accurate again to take the bishop first, then take on e7, and then everything collapses. But as it happens in the game, black errors as well with rook to d7. And after knight takes e6, white just gets an easy way to simplify and end the game. So very interesting game. Hopefully that was instructive, both in terms of how to deal with the Pirc defense and also how to handle some of those structural complications in the middle game. If you liked the video, please do leave a thumbs up on it and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We really do appreciate it. All right, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.